Welcome back to Turning Hard Times to Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have Daniel McAdams with me once again. And Daniel was with me a couple of weeks ago, I guess, but let me just, since he hasn't been a frequent guest, let me just go over a little bit of his background. He is the executive director of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. He served as foreign affairs advisor to Congressman Paul and until Dr. Paul's retirement at the end of 2012. In the 1990s, Daniel worked as a journalist based in Budapest, Hungary, including an editorial page editor of the Budapest Sun. He also served as a special rapporteur for the British Helsinki Human Rights Group while based in Europe, monitoring human rights and elections on the ground in various contentious states, including Albania during 1996-1998 civil unrest, Montenegro, Georgia, Armenia, Belarus, Croatia, and Slovakia. So some pretty troubled places where he was involved in trying to help people put together fair elections. He was a Phillips Foundation Journalism Fellow and an American Swiss Foundation Young Leader. He holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Berkeley, California at Berkeley, and completed coursework for a master's in international relations. So he was well suited to serve Ron Paul, as Ron Paul was a congressman and also a presidential candidate. Daniel, thank you so much for joining me again.
It's great to be back with you, Jay. Thanks for inviting me on.
It's really good to have you. Before we get into the discussion of today, I would like to just maybe you can tell our listeners what you and Dr. Paul have been talking about recently on TV and on your show. I guess it's the Ron Paul Liberty Report, and where people can go to tune into that and stay up to date with what the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity are up to.
Sure. Well, we're now live on Rumble at noon Eastern Time, Monday through Friday. Dr. Paul and I do Monday and Thursday, and then my colleague Chris Rossini comes in on Friday, and they mostly do economics issues. Our website is ronpaulinstitute.org. We don't publish a lot of articles every day, just a couple or two or three that you need to read that we decide are good things to read that day. We've got a conference coming up in Lake Jackson, Texas. It's our third big conference of the year, and we still have some tickets for that, and you can find out more at ronpaulinstitute.org. We're going to be talking about cancel culture and the war on free speech.
Yes, indeed. Certainly free speech was at least one time what America was known for, more than any other country, most democracies, I would suggest. Well, we've titled our show today, How Real is the Threat of Nuclear War? And we listened to Tulsi Gabbard and remarks that President Eisenhower made fearful of the military-industrial complex. But I'd like to start out perhaps by asking you, you're aware of Tulsi Gabbard. In fact, I think you and Dr. Paul talked about it on your television show. To what extent, if any, do you share Tulsi's concerns about the potential for nuclear war arising out of the Ukrainian conflict?
Well, I think the fears are very real. It used to be, and you remember this, Joe. I mean, Jay, I'm reading as I'm talking. You remember this, Jay. We grew up in the Cold War. This was an era where, we had two ideologically incompatible ideologies lined up with steam coming out of our ears, nuclear weapons aimed at each other. 40 years of this. Yet it was considered, with very, very few exceptions, and 62 was one of them, it was considered unimaginable to actually talk about using nuclear weapons in a battle. It was something that we did everything. We talked to the Soviets at the lowest point. We made agreements. We made détente. We agreed to limit our weapons. We agreed to do things that would make it impossible for first strike. This is what we were toe-to-toe with our great ideological enemy. Now, all of a sudden, when we don't have that foe, we don't have that same kind of foe, all of a sudden, people, and I would say particularly in Washington, are talking about the use of nuclear weapons. So I think simply the fact that we are considering and talking about them means that the threat is very, very high, because we've forgotten how horrific these weapons are.
Yeah. I don't know if you had it down there where you live in Texas, but we had commercials running on television channels in New York City, telling people how to react if there's a nuclear war, a nuclear weapon heading our way. And we played that clip. That ad was actually played on Joe Rogan's show when Tulsi Gabbard talked, and it's pretty ludicrous because we all knew. Well, I guess I can remember in grade school being told to go under your desks, which was pretty silly. I think people don't have any idea what a nuclear holocaust is like, I suppose. And do you think that we were very concerned because we saw the Soviet Union at that time as an equal power to us, and we think somehow no one is equal to us now, so we feel that we can push the envelope further?
Well, this is what happens when you believe your own mythology. Remember the old. This is going back 20 years. We're the exceptional state. We're the state above all. We're the chosen state. This whole idea, this American exceptionalism, it is kind of like a moral cancer that means nobody else means anything except for us, and the rest of the world needs to bow down in deference to the United States. Well, that's not the same world. The world has changed significantly, and I know you covered a lot of this on your show from an economic perspective, Jay, and that's very important because that feeds the political shifts that we're seeing. The economic shifts that we've seen are now fueling the political shifts and the reality that this is no longer a unipolar world. And just as the British were kicking and screaming after World War II, realizing that their empire is over, the United States, in particular the elites, can't believe what's happened to their American exceptionalism. It's over. It's dying. They're the ones that helped kill it, but they can't believe that it's going away.
Yeah, and somehow we think that the rest of the world, that we're doing them a favor, I guess, or we would like to think so. I wonder what kind of a favor we're doing for Europe now when we, have put, have forced them not to accept Russian gas, and what that means. The Europeans are suffering, and will be suffering a great deal more than we are this winter, and I guess already are with high energy prices and so forth. And Alistair MacLeod's made the point on this show on more than one occasion that he thinks Putin's grand design here is to get the United States out of Europe. Do you think that might be the case? And if so, would that be good or bad?
I'm not a huge fan of grand designs. I think they come from minds that may be too grand, although I have enormous respect for MacLeod. I think he's a great thinker. I don't know that it goes that far. I mean, so many people want to be inside Putin's brain. I don't think that foreign policy analysis that becomes sort of mystical and esoteric like that is very helpful. Mm-hmm. However, you want to talk about Europe's decline. The emperor is now exposed for having no clothing on. We see the explosion, the blowing up, the sabotage of Nord Stream 1 and 2. And now in the past week, we've heard the government of Sweden and the government of Germany saying we don't want to investigate it. Sweden says, well, we're not going to investigate it together with Germany and Denmark because we don't want to have to share our conclusions. And Germany, this is Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, said to a direct question, he said, we know who did it, but we can't say reasons. Now, are we supposed to believe if their investigations have shown that Russia did it, that they wouldn't be screaming from the highest hilltop, here's our investigation, here's what it shows? So Olaf Scholz, who is supposedly the head of a sovereign country, says, we can't tell you who did it. We can't tell you who destroyed our future for national security reasons. Wink, wink. It had to have been the U.S. It had to have been the U.S. acting together with Poland and perhaps Sweden. Otherwise, we certainly would be hearing from it. So it's astonishing to see how low the Europeans are willing to go to prostrate themselves before Washington, D.C.
Well, Daniel, the Russians can cut off gas in the pipeline. They don't have to blow it up. What conceivable logic would be behind Russia doing it? Why would they do it? Can you think of anything?
Well, governments do stupid things, so we all agree on that. But however, when you're in the middle of a war, that is a challenge, perhaps more of a challenge than you expected at first. A, you're going to waste $300 million worth of gas and multi-billions of dollars in infrastructure that you've created, plus you've destroyed the future of selling gas to your customer. Like you say, I mean, even Putin said, who benefits from it? Who the person who benefited is the person who committed the crime. Now, Germany doesn't benefit from it in any way, shape, or form. And in fact, Scholz was having to deal with massive protests in Berlin and elsewhere. And you can see them just over this past weekend. You see big protests in Germany, and there's huge banners that say Nord Stream. They want cheap gas. They don't want to freeze to death. And so the person or country who blew up the pipelines was afraid, I think, of Germany getting cold feet or a German government falling. And you see the AfD party, which is a right-wing populist party in Germany, making significant gains in the polls. And they're the only party in Germany that's not keen on isolating Russia and on sanctions with Russia. So you're looking at a lot of political risk with this. But what do? Well, you erase any possibility of Germany going back to its senses and actually protecting its citizenry.
We're supposed to, they call it our Defense Department, right? We spend these huge amounts of money for defense. I'm trying to understand, we asked the question during Vietnam, how a war on the other side of the world, how is that a threat to us? How is Putin a threat to us doing what he's doing? How is he a threat to the United States? I guess he's a threat to the arms industry, or actually maybe he's not a threat. Maybe he's helping the arms industry. But
he's an agent.
I mean, Americans are sort of accepting on the surface. Tulsi Gabbard says that policymakers we're going into these wars without policymakers ever asking, is it good or bad for the American people? So would like to understand, what is the connection between how we're at risk in America because Putin goes into the Ukraine? What sort of logic would they come up with?
The fact is, Russia could definitely be a threat to the United States. They have more nuclear weapons than we have. They have a missile called the Satan missile, which would absolutely probably end life in the United States. They have the technology to create a 600-meter-high tidal wave off of our coast. So I'm not living in fantasy world where I want to hug Putin. I'm trying to live in the world of reality. And that is that, yes, they are a threat, and they can be a threat. So that's all the more reason to try to find a way to work these issues out. And if we could go back to 2014, they had almost worked it out. There was a deal between the government in Ukraine and Russia to have a free trade agreement with some cash stuffed in there on the part of Russia to Ukraine. And there was simultaneously a deal with the EU. Now, Putin told Yanukovych at the time, the head of Ukraine, hey, if you want to make a deal with the EU, that's fine. We don't have to have an exclusivity in our trade relations. We will have good relations, and you can have good relations with the EU, and everything will be hunky-dory. I mean, there's a huge benefit between, for being a neutral state in between wealthy states on both sides, or relatively wealthy states on both sides, as Switzerland. But the EU said no, and Victoria Nuland, who, by the way, is Ukrainian, Tony Blinken is part Ukrainian. They brought a lot of their age-old prejudices to bear when they finally got power in 2014 and instigated the 2014 Maidan coup, which, of course, threw out of power the democratically elected Yanukovych and brought in a regime that made common cause with NATO, emboldened really bad actors in Ukraine, and it's very obvious how bad these actors are. And you had 8 years of Kiev shelling eastern Ukraine and killing its own citizens. So this was all going to come to a head eventually. And as we saw in February, it finally did. Nobody should be surprised except the fact that we do not have a free media in the United States, so nobody has ever heard this story. And in fact, we were contacted by a fact-checking organization just a couple of days ago saying, we're reviewing your website, and we found something that's of real concern to us. At one point, you wrote that the U.S. was involved in the 2014 coup. We just don't see how that's possible. And of course, we never respond to these queries, but I was tempted to send them a recording of Victoria Nuland on tape saying, blank the EU, here's who we're going to put into power when the coup's done.
Right. American people don't hear that, though. They don't know that. They don't know, for example, most Americans don't know that, in fact, when the Soviet Union fell, we promised them that NATO wouldn't take 1 inch of additional territory that was the former Soviet Union. And yet we marched right up to the Soviet Union's border now. And I guess it was a line too far across for Putin when we decided that we were going to put missiles on his border and add Ukraine into NATO. I mean, that's what we were talking about, right? Right before Putin invaded.
Yeah, and it just makes absolutely no sense. The NATO expansion made zero sense at the time, and there was a euphoria at the end of the Soviet Union, and I think a lot of the countries of Central Europe felt, and I was living there at the time, they felt it was a symbolic healing, I guess, process, return to the concept of the West to join Western institutions, of which the two of which being the EU and NATO of most significance. And so it was almost like a graduation from being under the boot of the Soviet Union to graduate to being part of the West. But now looking back in retrospect, and I was, of course, extremely opposed to NATO expansion at the time for a number of reasons. But looking back, the real question that Ron Paul was asking all along, even before I knew him and worked for him, was why is NATO still around? The Warsaw Pact is gone. NATO is a military alliance to confront a country that does no longer exist, the Soviet Union. So what is the point? And that's the real question.
Well, maybe Eisenhower had the answer when he was concerned about the military-industrial complex. And indeed, Tulsi Gabbard told Joe Rogan that one of the main reasons she thinks we keep pushing all these conflicts is because it makes a lot of money for the military-industrial complex. There's the other part, though, Daniel, bigger thing about, when you have empires, they do nasty things to people. All empires do, right? I mean, we wouldn't, you can't be an empire without doing nasty things to other countries. Do you agree with that?
That's absolutely true. And that's absolutely true. And that's why when we have fallen from being a republic to an empire, that's when you see the rise, as you say, of the military-industrial complex and the neocons and a whole class of elite oligarchs who do not have our interests at heart.
Eisenhower was worried in his speech that we played. He was worried about the threat of the military-industrial complex to our liberty. And, First Amendment rights is the thing that America was known for. I guess you could argue that we still have First Amendment rights. We're saying these things now in a public forum, although a small one. Maybe that's the key. And so I guess that's really the biggest concern I have is not only, of course, having to do with the military-industrial complex, but all other issues having to do with, we're having everything from the top down now. Doctors aren't allowed to be doctors anymore in California if they don't do what Governor Newsom tells them to and kowtow to whatever COVID platforms he's got, whatever COVID policies he wants, they'll lose their license in California, supposedly. I mean, this is unheard of in America. It's just, for an old guy like me that's been around for so long, it's very difficult to swallow. It's very difficult. But let me ask you this, Daniel. You were, the Ron Paul Institute, I think, was knocked off of YouTube, right? And that's why you're at Rumble now.
No, we had been kicked off a couple times temporarily, but we went to Rumble simply because we were concerned that YouTube was going to cancel us. And the guys at Rumble got in touch with us and said, hey, why don't you come over here for your live show? You're not going to have to worry about censorship or being kicked off. And they gave us a nice incentive. They feature our show live on their main page when we go live. So we still do put the show on YouTube, but our live show is carried on Rumble. And that's the good news, Jay, and that's the good news about capitalism, is that given enough incentive, alternatives do arise. And that's what we're starting to see.
Yeah. I mean, there's always the argument about, I guess maybe some of the communist leaders like to think that ultimately capitalism would self-destruct and go away. Well, policymakers can sure do a job in terms of destroying capitalism. We've seen it in the financial markets with interest rates being driven to zero. Misallocation of capital does enormous damage to the economy, to people's lives ultimately. Of course, some people get filthy rich with that kind of policy, and maybe not the least of which is the military-industrial complex, that plenty of money around to finance all these expensive weapons and all. So that's good, and I think that Rumble's doing pretty well, from what I understand. I mean, there's a lot of fairly big name people that are going there now. Tulsi Gabbard, one of them.
They've got some top people. They've got Tulsi, they've got Glenn Greenwald, they've got Russell Brand. So they're attracting talent from the right to the left to beyond, which shows you that people want to hear things outside the approved narrow view of the mainstream. So-called mainstream, because I think we are actually the mainstream. So it's a good thing. It's a good thing to see.
Well, that's very good. I have a good friend at the church I attend who's a former journalist, and he gets after me sometimes, suggesting that I'm too pessimistic, and he's suggesting that, Jay, there is hope. There's a lot of truth that's being spoken, not on the mainstream, the so-called mainstream, but I mean, just look at a lot of people from the Democrat Party that have left, or people that were considered to be very far to the left, are now, speaking their minds. So it's very difficult, I think, in a country like ours where we've had a tradition of freedom of speech, to shut it down, right? It's very difficult.
It is hard. They did a good job in 2 years of COVID to prepare us for this, but we do have a chance to fight back.
Well, in terms of fighting back, any thoughts about the upcoming elections? I'm sure you and Dr. Paul talk about it. I don't know how much you talk about it on your show, but you think there would be a bit of a swing back?
I think so. I wish I could be more optimistic about it, though, but I don't feel that much better about a House in control of McCarthy and the Senate in control of McConnell. So I mean, I'm not a voter, Jay. So, but I mean, on the other hand, these guys are so evil that are running things now. Any kind of change might upset a little bit of the apple cart. And plus, there are a lot of Americans that are expecting a lot if things do change. So there theoretically could be some pressure on a Republican-led House and or Senate to actually get something done. So we'll see. Yeah, am I rooting for it secretly? Yes, because these guys are they're just demons. But I don't have any illusions about the angels being on the other side.
Yeah, I'm afraid. I'm afraid that's right, and certainly independents. Tulsi Gabbard didn't run off to the Republican Party, so there's a reason for that too.
I hope she doesn't. I wouldn't mind. I mean, if she could lead, and I think there's some exciting things happening in the Republican Party, and I think the Republican Party has a future if it embraces some of the things with all the flaws that Trump embraced, which is start being the party of the working man again, start being the party of the blue collar again. And I don't mean endorsing all sorts of union subsidies and all this garbage. I mean in terms of your policies. Start being the party of anti-war. There's a lot of energy in anti-war populism, and it's coming from the right, not from the left anymore. So there could be a future for the Republican Party, and I just hope some of these young guys and gals that are running that have that kind of energy, I just hope they do well. We've had a couple of them on our show and hope that we'll continue to see them doing well.
Yeah, you mentioned anti-war. Well, certainly it seems to me that one of the things, I know you're not a big fan of Trump. I believe I'm accurate in saying that, nor was Dr. Paul, for various reasons. But and certainly from a financial point of view, his handling of the markets. I mean, he was all in favor of massive amounts of money printing. So, but in terms of his foreign policy, and I'm wondering if one of the reasons they weren't out to get him from day one and accuse him falsely of things he never did was because of his stance. He ran on a policy of not starting new wars. And he made good on that policy. With just 2 minutes left, maybe, do you think if Trump were in office, do you think it's possible we might not have a war in Ukraine right now?
I think so. And there's a lot to like about Trump. I just wish that Trump was actually Trump. You know, there was a lot of bluster there, but not a lot of follow through. My good friend Doug McGregor, who was supposed to be ambassador to Germany, Trump did nothing to fight for him. He could have put him in a position of serious authority without needing Senate approval. He did that with literally days left in his presidency and told Colonel McGregor, hey, go out and get us out of Afghanistan and Syria. You know, so I think he has very good instincts. I wish he would follow through. I wish he would have pardoned Julian Assange. He could have done so many other things, pardoned some of these wrongly accused people who simply demonstrated on January 6th, who did not harm anything, could have pardoned some of these people. He could have done a lot more. Maybe he'll have a wake-up call if he makes it back in and make good on some of the mistakes he made when he's in the first time.
Well, I just know that your friend and mine, Jeff Deist, thinks that they won't allow Trump to run again. Certainly, there's a lot of people trying to keep that from happening. But I see that we are almost out of time. Daniel, I want to thank you so much for spending your time with us. Lots of other things I would like to ask you about, foreign policy and so forth, but we are out of time, so I want to thank you very much. And again, tell people that they could go to the Ron Paul Institute. And what's the channel again? Where to go? It's Ron Paul Institute.
RonPaulInstitute.org, and find us on Rumble at Ron Paul Liberty Report.
Very good. Excellent. Well, I hope people will do that because there's a lot of excellent content there. Thank you, Daniel, so much for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Thanks, Jay. Bye-bye.